Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another Game for Thought live stream. My name is Ali Weiss. I am the ethics coordinator in international game development here at Hoest Digital Arts and Entertainment, commonly called DIE, and I'm thrilled to bring you the second live stream in the month of March, this time tackling the topic of religion in games. If you are new to Game for Thought, you are so welcome to join us this evening. If you are a frequent flyer at Game for Thought, it's lovely to see you again. Just a quick overview of what Game for Thought is all about. We started this live stream series in 2020. I can't believe it's been 4 years now, about ethically relevant topics in the games and digital entertainment industry. We are a digital entertainment higher education institution, and since a lot of our classes are very technically focused, we decided that it was really important to have a platform where we could openly and honestly discuss more ethically, societally relevant topics, such as the topic this evening about religion in games. We will shortly jump into a panel discussion with 4 experts within education and the games industry. And of course, at the end of the live stream, we will definitely save some time for audience questions. So be sure to put your questions in the chat. Just make sure that you put a Q beforehand so we know that it's a question. And of course, we will be collecting these questions throughout the panel discussion to then tackle toward the end of the evening. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. We can't wait to start this discussion. And without further ado, I would love to introduce our 4 panelists from the evening. Joining us from Belgium, the Netherlands, and the United States. Firstly, we have Bram de Ridder. Bram is the founder of Sunken Tower. He is also a freelance game designer here in Belgium. We have Rachel Wagner. Rachel is the professor and chair of the philosophy and religion department at Ithaca College in upstate New York in the United States. We have Lars de Wildt. Lars is a professor at the Center for Media and Journalism Studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And we have Liesbeth last. Liesbeth is an esports teacher at KTA Brugge, which is a secondary school, and a researcher at KU Leuven here in Belgium. So as always, you see that we have panelists joining us from all over the world. Maybe some of you are also joining from other parts in the world that are not Belgium. Very welcome here during this Game for Thought discussion about religion in games. Without further ado, I'd love to bring our panelists over. Again, any questions, put them in the chat, and we will see you in just a second. Hang tight. Alrighty, and we are back. Hello there, Bram, Lars, Liesbeth, and Rachel. It's such a pleasure to have you joining this panel, Game for Thought panel about religion in games this evening. It's always way more fun when you introduce yourselves, isn't it? So I would love to hear a bit about your backgrounds, why you are inclined to join the stream and chat about religion in games. Bram, I'm so sorry to put you on the spot. I see you first, so go right ahead. Hello, Bram. Welcome.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to this discussion. In terms of who I am and why I'm on this panel, I guess it's sort of a coincidence in the sense that I really don't think I ever really sought out religious topics or doing or having anything to do with religion per se. But it keeps popping up in my work, starting with the fact that I used to do a PhD in history on border formation, but during the wars of religion in Europe. So religion popped up there. After that, I worked on a project as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Leuven, whereby we try to use the history of religious conflict and religious living together. I can't remember the English word now, but use those historical cases to stimulate discussion among students on contemporary issues. And then now, during COVID, I moved a bit into the gaming sector, a bit of a coincidence as well. Started playing Age of Empires, thought there might be something interesting going on there with the history. Met Lars, which was another stimulus to start looking into what history could mean for games or its meaning in games. And then I did a few assignments for a few startup companies, helping them with their game design. And one of those games also really heavily involved religion. So I really had to think about how they were using religion, how they could use it, what the implications would be when the game would be out and about. So that was one thing. And then last year, I also started working on my own card and board games. And actually, the first card game that I produced was launched last December. And it's entirely based on a medieval Bible. So the topic itself is not religious, but the material, the graphics that I'm using is involved with biblical material. And so I've been asked by a few people in religious circles, like, oh, is this interesting for us as well? So even though it's not my core audience, people who are really into religion asked me, is this a product that we could find interesting as well? So religion keeps popping up in everything I do, but I have the luxury of looking a bit more as an outsider towards it. So that's sort of the background of what I've been doing the last few years, and I think why I'm here tonight.
Thank you so much, Bram. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Also, really interesting as someone who maybe, not consciously was combining the worlds of religion and games, yet you find yourself kind of at this intersection. So I'm really excited to dive into that in just a bit. Thanks so much for being here. Lars, hello. Great to see you.
Hi. I guess the other white guy goes second. That's me. Uh, Ramadan Mubarak for those of you who observe that. Happy Nowruz for people who celebrate that today, the Iranian New Year. I'm Lars. I'm an assistant professor. I study video games and worldview, which for a large part of my career was about religion, although I've also worked on militarism, nationalism, stuff like that. Once I read this book by one Rachel Wagner, I got really into the topic of
I
why do
wonder where
people
she
put
is. Is she in this panel too?
no, the question became kind of why do people put religion in video games? So I started building from other people's work by specifically by researching game developers, including people who worked for on Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed is one of my core examples. Indies in Melbourne, all that kind of stuff, which I made into my own book on the pop theology of video games, which I recommend you read instead of listening to me. It's much more interesting. That's it. Nice to meet you.
Wonderful. So great to have you here, Lars. Can't wait to dive in to some of the things that you've worked on as well a bit later on in our discussion. Rachel, speaking of a book by Rachel, hello there. Welcome. Rachel, I think you're muted. I'm so sorry to share with you. However, I saw your book.
There. This is just
there we
I'm
go
on Discord.
Technology's fun,
yeah,
right?
my book. That came out 2011, 2012. So I'm a professor of religion at Ithaca College. I've been here forever, and I've been thinking about this stuff for a really long time too. So I don't know, probably back in the early aughts. I was a single parent of a teenager who was playing lots of games, and I was thinking about religion and culture more generally. I had been thinking about religion in film. I was one of the first scholars interpreting the film The Matrix, and realized I had a facility in thinking about those things. And there was a book about religion and film, and how film is like religion and how it can serve some of those functions. And I thought, well, if film can do that, video games can do that all the more, because there's more agency, right? And so in what ways might video games work like rituals? And that was one of the questions that prompted this book. And this book came from sort of wanting to understand what the questions were. And so that's kind of how I got into it. And there's a chapter in this book towards the end dealing with violence, and that and apocalypse. There's another chapter dealing with apocalypse, and just wanting to understand how violence works in video games, because it is virtual violence. My new work and my new book, Cowboy Apocalypse, really deals with the representation of the gun and how representations of guns can relate or not relate to real life gun violence, especially in America. So that's me.
So great to have you here, Rachel. Thank you so much joining us from upstate New York. Hope it's sunny where you are. We're finally having some spring-ish weather here in Belgium, so I hope the same for you. And last but not least, Liesbeth, hello there.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be a part of this panel. I'm Liesbeth Last. First of all, I'm a gamer. And then I'm also a theologian and an Islamic theologian. So I studied at the KU Leuven. And I'm really born for my educational career. I really love teaching students between 14 and 18 years old. That's really my core business. It's been 7 years now that I'm writing every month. I'm really a good girl every month. A practical article about religion. I have now 66 articles. It's a lot, so it surprised me also. And it's articles about religion and video games for a platform for teachers of religion in Belgium. And they appear at the Thomas platform for the KU Leuven. I also make podcasts to actualize religious topics, and it's also for teachers. So I'm really making some materials that they can use in their classrooms, and it's a great. It's an honor to have that chance. I'm also a teacher esports in the beautiful city of Brugge, and we are the first school in Belgium that organized this subject. But that's not the core business of tonight. Tonight it's about religion and video games, and I'm looking forward to this panel.
So great to have you here, Liesbeth. I said earlier in our chat that we have not yet had a panelist who also is a teacher at a secondary school. So I'm thrilled to have you on board. You have a super interesting background, both with religion, games, and esports. So it is a pleasure. We will dive right into it with perhaps a question that maybe some people in the audience are also wondering. I have just also heard it around. The question is, why is the topic of religion in games avoided? Why are people sometimes hesitant to talk about this topic? Even when I mentioned, for example, that this was going to be the topic of the live stream, there's some hesitance there, and I'm very curious to hear from you four, since you're very busy with the subject, why this topic is kind of shied away from. And whoever, Lars, yes, go right ahead.
If no one's eager to jump in.
Jump right in, Lars. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously know religion as either something that causes conflict, right? As Bram, as a historian, can attest. But mostly, I feel like it's just a boring niche thing, right? For most kind of demographics that play video games, which we know is mostly North Americans, Europeans of a certain background. Most of us will not be religious. And so, we're not really interested necessarily in the topic. And it's kind of odd then that when I started researching this, I started talking to developers, people who were working on, Assassin's Creed and stuff like that, which, let me remind you, is a game where Templars and kind of Hashashin, kind of vaguely, the history is a bit more complicated, but vaguely kind of Muslim groups are vying for the apple of Eden, and then like in come all these kind of Greek mythological subjects. And there's a bunch of games and examples we can name as a group, I think. But then when I started talking to the people that make them, they were like, what do you mean? Like, where's the religion? Like, what do video games have to do with religion anyway? And I think it's become such a mundane kind of mainstay in the games we play, right? That we have, if we see like a big guy with like a shield with a cross on it, we know that's a paladin. We know what they do. We know that when we enter certain spaces and it looks like a church, we know it's safe. We know that priests heal, just like we know that, you're supposed to walk to the right when you start a game, right? It's just a kind of boring convention that I want to argue we don't really see anymore, because it's become such a staple kind of convention in the language of game design. So one of the reasons I think to quit talking, that religion is such a kind of niche, boring, maybe even controversial topic. I don't know about that, just because we don't really see it anymore for how basic and conventional it becomes until you think about it.
Okay, really interesting take there. So Lars, quite frankly, for some it's boring, I'm hearing. And also B, it is so intrinsically in so many games we play, in role-playing games, in D&D, you mentioned, for example, like paladins, that it is kind of, even overlooked at this point because it's so intrinsically there. Wondering if anyone else has anything to add. Go ahead, Rachel.
Well, one of the examples that I deal with in my book is from 2007, and it's Manchester Cathedral and the violence that takes place in it, in Resistance: Fall of Man. And if for those who aren't familiar, there's this digital replica of Manchester Cathedral in an alternate timeline, and you have to go in and shoot these creatures and kill them. And it really upset the church, specifically the people at Manchester Cathedral. And so I think that maybe part of the hesitation, I think, the things that Lars said is true, but I think when it does sort of bubble to the surface, that people aren't sure how to talk about it, right? What are the categories that we need to understand this position, Sony's position versus the cathedral's position, right? And so we have to understand things about people's beliefs about images and representation, people's beliefs about sacred spaces, and we have to understand how agency works in games. And we need to be clear about what we think about performance in games and how it might relate to real life or not. And we have to understand something about religious storytelling, right? To know what would be offensive to change and what would not. So, and all of these, I think, are related to this core notion of the theory of play, that there's some sort of set structure, procedure, or story, and what can we do with it, right? Where's the wiggle room before people are bothered or offended? And so I think it takes a lot to be able to talk about this stuff. So I would just add that in as maybe part of the hesitation.
Yeah, absolutely. I would completely agree. Actually, I think there's like so much hesitance because people are also afraid that it's going to be like innately controversial in some way. And in that way, you shy away from it completely. Definitely. Um, just as we kind of dive into the basics of the topic, I also want to know if the role of religion in games has evolved or changed over time, from older titles to newer releases, if you've seen a change with regards to the depiction of religion or involvement of religious themes within games. Would anyone like to share? Yes, Lars, I see
I
you.
mean, I felt like Bram was really going to say something, but I'm sure he'll jump in later. No, I mean, what I've noticed is that any kind of game, especially if it's a franchise that goes on long enough, becomes less historically and less culturally specific, right? So I'm going to use Assassin's Creed a lot, but we could say the same about the D&D RPGs you mentioned earlier, where things usually can be quite specific, like literally using the Manchester Cathedral as another example, right? Zelda in 1987, we see the concept art of like Link praying to a Mary statue, right? Specifically Catholicism. But then as your audience expands, which, you know, we're talking about the biggest cultural industry in the world, of course, making more money than movies and music combined. Um, People can't really alienate groups anymore. So you want to be less specifically religious. So if anything changes, or at least from what I see, and I'm curious if people disagree with that, it just becomes kind of more vaguely wishy-washy religion for everyone. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has anything.
So it's become less specific over time. Bram, I see. I think
Yeah,
yes, go
I
right
think
ahead.
Liesbeth also wants to jump in, but picking up on the heads up by Lars, I think it also ties a bit. I don't have any hard data, but it probably ties a bit back to what Lars was saying earlier with the previous question. In the sense, what I remembered from his dissertation, which I really loved, is that yes, religion is not avoided in games, it's ignored. It is there, it is everywhere. You always it's Whenever you start looking for it, you pick up on these religious elements, so it's not avoided. But what is there is ignored. It's not talked about, it is not put forward, it's not put on display. And I think that as time went on, that perhaps what little active engagement with religion there was, so conscious choices not to the religion in the game, not to ignore it, that has become a bit more difficult, and people have become more wary of that. So religion is still there. It's not that it's disappeared. It's changing in content. It's becoming more subliminal. But the real hard engagement, people shy away from that for commercial reasons, for the risk that they see with it. I've seen it with the studios I worked with, that they're really hesitant to really delve into it from a commercial perspective. But in terms of, is it still there? Yes, it is still there, and it always has been there. I think that's something that we shouldn't overlook.
Absolutely. Liesbeth, anything to add as well?
Yes, I think I read a book. It was of Fitz Sisler in 2006, I guess. It was a very interesting title. In in video games, you shoot Arabs or aliens. That was 2006. So indeed, there you had the American nation, the American warriors who had to protect against threats from the Middle East. So I think now, these days, we don't have popular video games who are showing Muslims in that way. I think so. There is a kind of evolution in showing religion in video games, and indeed, it's a little bit vague because my articles also, it's so vague that I can do a lot of things with it. It's just a starter to start a conversation. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue also into my next question, which a lot of our community also were really enthusiastic to hear the answer to this. We've already talked about how developers, consumers shy away from this topic, and it's not avoided as much as it is actually just ignored, because of cultural sensitivities also, and the possibility of offending religions or groups of people. And so I want to ask, from a game developer's perspective, how do you find a balance between creative agency or freedom and being mindful to cultural sensitivities, with the goal of creating something that is a positive or constructive experience for the player and not offensive? Yes, go right ahead, Liesbeth. Everyone's so polite with the. I love that you're raising your hands. It's so polite. Go right ahead, Liesbeth. Take it away. Oh, I think you're muted, Liesbeth. I'm so sorry to be the
Okay.
bearer of bad news. There you go.
Beginner's mistake. I think you all know the game Last of Us Part 2, and there they do something very beautiful about Judaism. There you have Ellie and Dina, I guess. Yeah, they are walking into a synagogue, and they're all of a sudden there's a closet, and they open the closet and they see the Torah, and then you have Ellie who is asking, what is that? And Dina, she's a Jewish girl in the game, is explaining it. And it was not that long, but it was long enough to think about it. And that was a really nice thing. It was very small. But it was correct, and it was in respect of the Judaism. So I really love that. I'm starting here with an example. Maybe the others can go further.
There's a great example I wanna bring up by Osama Dorias, who's he's a Saudi Canadian developer I really like. He used to work for Warner Brothers and Ubisoft and Blizzard. He's now with Brass Lion, I believe. And he one of his best talks he ever gave was on Muslim representation and how to kind of do that. Where I think it was the best talk at GDC 2017 that year. Was awarded, and so it's not a secret that he cried while delivering it also, because what he saw was kind of the cultural insensitivity of, for a long time, kind of seeing it as a normal thing to shoot Arab Muslim people, that any character that kind of yelled Allahu Akbar or had an AK or all those dehumanizing kind of cliches kind of normalized this cultural insensitivity towards specifically Muslims, and specifically Arab or Arab presenting Muslims or people from the MENA region. Um, and I don't know how the game developers in the room besides Osama Dorias kind of deal with that, but it was obviously at that point like kind of a convenience shortcut, right, in terms of artistic freedom or whatever, to say, okay, it's the war on terror. We all know what the enemy looks like, but at the same time, I think Osama made a good point of saying, look where it got us. Like it dehumanized a specific group so much based on largely kind of religious stereotypes that we're now kind of facing, well, what some might call, what I call an ongoing genocide, where we kind of don't recognize that certain people have the right to live or exist. Because partly in video games and movies, we've seen these people just as cannon fodder for decades, right?
Maybe if I can pick up on that, the point of artistic freedom is interesting in the sense that as far as games are an art, I think you can do anything with them. So it's a form of art. Art has been controversial. Art has been hurtful. So it can be that, but it needs to be conscious in the sense that it needs to be, when you decide to do something, do it with thought and do it with respect. So if you're working on a game that might upset religious people, um, don't do it without a second thought. Do it for the reasons that you say. I hear and I see you, but I disagree. I think a respectful disagreement can also happen in a game. That is very much possible. But what you can't do is as Lars says, just walk over their beliefs, their religion, just for commercial convenience. Um, that is very disrespectful. But I've been asked a question for historical topics as well. Are there topics in history that you shouldn't deal with, or that you really should avoid, or shouldn't take a position in? I think you can take any position given that it's art, but then when you're asked questions, make sure that you have the answers and that you can deliver them in a respectful way. And that is really something I often do recommend to game developers, like make the conscious choices when you're dealing with these topics, and just don't assume that your criticism, because a lot of people still want to criticize religion and all religions or religions in particular. Okay, you can do that. That's your point as an artist, as a developer. It's your freedom to do that. But let me then be your soundboard, and let those communities themselves also be your soundboard and challenge you on what you are saying. And then you have a respectful dialogue on the basis of the game. And I think that is a good way to progress as a game developer.
I think it's really important, Bram, that you mentioned that it needs to be conscious. The intention also needs to be very clear. And I think there was the question that we started with, that was, why is this topic avoided? And now, or maybe ignored, we found out through the discussion. And I also want to ask why game developers should consciously integrate religion or religious themes into games. We first asked the question, why is it avoided? Now I want to ask why. Why in general? Why include religious themes and topics within games? What is the benefit? What do you gain as a developer or as a consumer from integrating this within your games? Feel free to share from both the consumer perspective, as people who also play games, or from the developer standpoint. Lars.
It's a good reason to include kind of surface level religion, is because it explains so much, right? Like, you don't have to explain a world where, like, this is how magic works, and this is why you can heal people, or this is why this guy makes us stronger. It's like, just explain that it's religion, and it's fine.
So on a very surface level, it makes it immediately easier for the player to understand kind of like the world, the scenario that they find themselves in the game. Anything else? Why? Why include religion within games? I know there are students out there, for example, who are studying game design and development here at this university, and I think why is a big question for them. So I'm really excited to dive into this. Liesbeth, go right ahead.
I think it's important because video games can, and the content of video games can open up conversations. It's often the case that young gamers or gamers do not always link the content to conversations, but I have the impression that with my friends I talk a lot about video games and also about the content. So it opens up. It's providing your friendship a lot, but also society. You talk about, you are philosophical about, like, BioShock, for example. That are topics that you talk about with other gamers. And I think talking about a video game, and certainly for developers, it's must be an honor to be a conversation, to be the subject of a conversation. So for me, it's very important, and certainly for the conversations.
Rachel, go right ahead.
Well, I mean, the question of why one should, I think, is trickier for me, because I'm thinking about different ways of integrating it, right? Some ways that are, I would say, healthy, and some ways that are not. So the Last of Us example, Liesbeth, that you cited is a great one, because, right, it's not, you can't, like, take the Torah out and blow it up, right? So in terms of agency, your engagement with these pre-existing religious practices, beliefs, or representations, I think, and I'm not a designer, but I think designers have to be very deliberate when they're integrating this material in terms of what the player can do and what they can't do, and maybe sort of keep that protected or off limits in certain ways to prevent, disruptive behavior. Sometimes when I teach, I've used, and I don't know if it's still on YouTube, there's a short video, and it was a joke, but it was imagining the passion. It's a bad joke. It was imagining the Passion of the Christ as a video game. And it shows the scene, right, where the soldiers are beating Jesus. And so they're, it's we. And so they're, shaking their controllers. And so it's this very, very dark humor, but it's getting right at that issue of what should you be able to do in a game when you're engaging with religious practice. And that's where these dialogues can come into play, right? And it's where we want to consult with people. I mean, we have to presume that the goal is not to offend. I suppose sometimes it might be, but I think the issues of bleed, right, when the game spills over into real life, we have to think about that, think about agency, and think about representation, among other things.
Yeah, you mentioned representation, Rachel, as well. And I think Bram also alluded to this a bit earlier, talking to people from religious groups about the representation of these themes within the games. And I'm very curious to hear from you all if you've had experiences, whether it's from the education side or game development side, talking to religious groups about involvement of themes within games. How have those discussions gone? Because obviously, right, making games also is a very collaborative process. And so a lot of different parties are involved. And in terms of authentic representation, it's really important to have those conversations with, leaders of religious groups. Just very curious to hear about your experiences speaking with religious groups about this topic, actually.
Maybe jumping in right away from a developer's perspective or designer's perspective. The issue itself is crucial. The two Americans amongst us will know the phrase "no taxation without representation." I would like to add no representation without communication. So you need to talk with the people that you're describing or using in your game, because you're using them and their religion to a certain extent. There are two things that I would like to add. One is the practicality. I mean, you would think that talking to people doesn't cost anything, but it costs time, and so it is part of the development process that could take time and money for that reason. So for one of the games that really deals with religion that I've been consulting on, it's really key that we do that at a certain point, but just in the process of finding the money and keeping things going, it's difficult to fit it in, and so far it hasn't happened as far as I know for that reason. So it is in practical terms, it is more difficult than it might seem to do it, even though I find it very crucial that you do it. The other thing is, religion is a hugely complex topic, as I think everybody around this virtual table knows. So there is a risk that you say, okay, we're working with Muslims, or we're working with Orthodox Christians, or we're working with Hindus, so we're going to talk to those people. But you have different sects in those religions, different belief systems within those religious systems. You have different countries, different nationalisms, other identities that tie into this. So if I would ask a Muslim, do you feel that what we're doing here is correct towards your religion? It matters whether I'm talking to a Sunni or a Shia Muslim, whether I'm talking to someone from Iraq or someone from Indonesia. So it very quickly becomes very, or can become very complex, and that means that you shouldn't also use it as sort of a code to hide behind. Like, we've talked to 5 Muslims and they all agreed that this was fine, but we've ignored all the other ideas about what Islam is or can be or was. So it on 2 levels it can be very difficult practically to implement this, even though it's very important. And I really honestly don't have a full answer to what is the best practice then? So maybe someone else can help there with their own experiences, because in practical terms, it's really difficult to organize it correctly, I think.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you're honest about that too, Bram, that it's both very important, but also practically sometimes difficult to actually make come to fruition. Rachel, I'm also very, very curious about your experiences as you work within the philosophy and religion department. So I'm sure you are very often communicating with religious professionals and educators, but you're also very much connected to the game space. So I'm wondering how that communication goes.
Well, I mean, I'm really more connected in terms of scholarship and other people who work on gaming. This is Ithaca College is it's an interesting school. It's fairly secular, for the most part. And I have not been invited to work on development in games. But Bram, I did want to say that I mean, it's a different kind of consulting, but one could approach, right, scholars of religion who are more likely to have an overview, and that has its own problems and its own limitations as well. So I don't know. I mean, my approach is more theoretical than the practical in terms of design. So I'm not sure that I can give you a good answer to that.
And that is totally fine. It is not a worry at all. Diving into our next question, we've also talked a bit about the risk of stereotyping or overgeneralizing certain populations within the games. And I'm curious to hear from you all if there's any studies, if there's any research done regarding consumers, game players being engaged with these games in which maybe there are characters that are represented in a very stereotypical way, and that having some kind of bleed into their view or perception of a religion in perhaps a negative way. So again, a question about the bleed from experiencing something that's stereotypically shown and actually believing that oneself.
Well, I will take that in a particular direction. We'll see what happens. One of the things that I taught a class on religion and play last semester. And one of the days we were looking at just some of the little games that that you can find online. And so we were thinking about the conflict, right? Israeli-Gaza conflict. And there's all kinds of games, and they're highly stereotypical. And right now I'm thinking of a game called Raid Gaza, and you just play it online, and all you do is you shoot at Gaza, right? And so there's a procedural rhetoric there. There's a sort of process that's engaged, and the process itself makes a particular kind of argument about Israel's power, about, the disposability of the people in Gaza. And so it's rather shocking, really, even though you don't see people represented. You see tanks, you see bombs, you see cities. And there's another game sort of coming from, and the very binary, I think, is problematic. But there's Knights of Alexa Mox, which came out, I think, in 22. And it's a first-person shooter from a Palestinian perspective. And so you're just shooting people. So we have these games that are highly stereotypical, that keep people categorized, right, in us versus them, right, good versus evil from whichever perspective you're playing in. And those are the kinds of games, honestly, that I see as the most problematic and also as the least interesting. So I think I'm gonna see if anyone else has thoughts on that kind of gaming. But there's also the spillover, right, in terms of how people understand real life conflict. That both of these games, in different ways, encourage people to oversimplify extremely complicated issues.
Exactly, and I think And then Lars, I'll pass it right over to you. I also think that exactly what you just said, Rachel, that is a core reason behind people really shying away from this topic in general. Extremely oversimplified, generalized game examples like the ones that you just shared. Lars, I'll pass it right over to you.
Yeah, what I'm always interested in, because it's difficult to kind of measure, right? Like we don't like to see like a good psychological validated measure where if we see people in a certain way represented in film or whatever, then do we actually act on that? That's kind of difficult. What's easier and what's a little bit clearer, I think, is to look at what is the unstated default in our popular culture, right? And especially in the AAA space. What we see represented is usually, and we all know this rhetoric, right? Like when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, most of our protagonists, if we take, 1,000 best-selling games, they're going to be white guys. Like they're going to be white men, because we can all identify with that default, right? So I interviewed, because I struggled with this question. I was curious about it. I interviewed Hindu and Christian and Buddhist and pagan and Jehovah's Witnesses, game developers and so on, and kind of asked them like, why don't you represent yourself? Like, why don't you have like a Hindu protagonist or something? And that obviously in the AAA space, it doesn't work because you can't sell it to the widest audience or something, right? But usually their excuse, even in indie spaces, so for independent game developers, right, was that like, we can't do that. The game becomes about that. We can't really explain it when we use anything, cultural identity or whatever. As soon as you step into that kind of, as soon as you make that decision, the entire game becomes about that, and it becomes like a niche game for Hindu gamers, or like it's a game about for Indonesian people about Indonesian people, or for Gaza or the Middle East for gamers from there. So like the unstated default will always be, again, even for Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, and pagan game developers, to like, we got to make games about the Eurocentric default. Maybe one final comment there, and this is something that I got from Rami Ismail, right? This is not my great idea. Obviously, famous Egyptian Muslim game developer. Rami said, look, if games didn't come from the West, if games didn't arbitrarily come to exist or come to arise in, let's say, Japan and North America dominantly, if they were to come from the Middle Eastern region, a paladin wouldn't be a good guy, right? It's kind of an arbitrary cultural default that we just kind of set up as a convention, for the same reason that like a shaman is this, or a druid even, is like this scary kind of nature force. And it's just because there's no real space, both in AAA game development and in indie development, to kind of do something different there.
I also just I because we're having this conversation about and I'm sorry, this wasn't on the question list, so I apologize. But because we're having this conversation about stereotypes, about generalizing, about the cultural default that you mentioned, Lars. Liesbeth, I'm looking to you because you are also a teacher at a secondary school, tackling the topics of religion, but also you're very much into the digital space as well. You also teach esports. And I'm wondering how you tackle these themes and topics actually with people of ages 14 to 18, because that's also a very crucial age in terms of development, and in terms of shaping our like societal views. That is a really important age. And sometimes this theme can be quite heavy. And I wonder how you tackle it at your school in Bruges.
It's not the point of my lessons to create some violence or some discussions who can be violent. So most when I feel that problematic speech is coming up with one of my students, I'm not going to how do you say it, feed that. I'm not going to I'm not going to put some oil on the fire. So most of the, because you're in a group, they are adolescents, they are 16, 17 years, so they are very sometimes frustrated. And certainly when it goes about religion, it's a theme that for them can be really close by, but they don't want to share a lot in group. So when I see some people that are really struggling with something that is said, I always talk with them in private or with some others that had conflicted them with their point of view. So in group, we are most of the part we are doing the content of the game, the content of my curriculum. So it's a little bit, how do you say it? It's a bit far away from the subject that they are frustrated about or that they are touched about. But sometimes you see in the classroom people who are touched by something another one says. So sometimes it's possible that I go into that in the classroom, but mostly when that occurs, I go talk to them in private, because it can be really painful. The stories that are behind those children are sometimes really bad and sad even. So it's not my goal to getting get them upset, and that's an important one.
And kind of piggybacking off also the theme of education, as I'm also here at a higher education institution for game design and development. And I also want to hear from you all what you think the gain is. What is the added benefit or value of making this link between religion and games? I think, I'm not sure. I can't speak to our student demographic in this way, but perhaps a lot of the students aren't religious, for example. If a lot of the students aren't religious or it's more of a secular kind of environment, why make the connection between religion and games within the educational space? Liesbeth, head over to you first.
Okay, so video games come directly from the world of the students. So bringing in a video game in the classroom can be really, really motivating and open up conversations and discussions, like I said before. And it's often the case that young gamers do not always take the lead in classroom, young gamers, or in discussions, without wanting to generalize this, of course. But when I'm talking about a video game in school, you get a different audience that speaks up in class, and that's interesting. And it's also important to include video games in education, so media literacy can be addressed to them. Um, so bringing video games in classroom is not only about religion, but everything around it, and it also can tackle ethical issues. I base my lesson starters, my articles for the KU Leuven, on the religious education curriculum. So that's an important one. So that's the frame that I'm moving in. And the articles I write are more, you can see them as a code rack or an impulse to hang certain lessons, content of lessons on it. And the added value for the student is that religion and philosophy of life are found in many cultural products, not only in video games, but also in movies, music, and so on. And that it's important that a good understanding of religion therefore also means, I hope, a better understanding of society and of all the cultural products that they are facing it. Because in Dutch we say unknown is unloved, and that's why I'm using video games in my educational career.
And may I ask, Liesbeth, as well, what kinds of games are you using within the classrooms? Are there any like specific titles that you use within your lesson plans, or
I will
like a bespoke kind of lesson or game?
I will put the link to my video games in the chat.
Yes,
Um,
that is a super good point. Unfortunately, I think Twitch is Twitch blocks weirdly URLs. However, on
Okay.
that note, I'm going to Liesbeth send that to me, and I will absolutely put it in the link. This video will be uploaded onto YouTube shortly after it ends, and all of the links and books and everything that we discussed during the stream, I will link that in the YouTube video. But go right ahead, Liesbeth, and explain the link that Twitch blocked. I'm very sorry about that.
No problem. I use the COTS video games, the commercial of the shelf, but also indie games because they know those games. So, for example, my next video game will be my next article. I'm not a game developer. Will be Helldivers 2. I have a couple of students who really love it, and I'm linking it with the Tower of Babel. So it's an interesting concept because man is really ambitious, and how far does that ambition go? So I really use the commercial video games, so I really want to attract them with that kind of video games. Is that an answer to your question? Like, maybe I will give some examples. Like Uncharted, like The Lost Legacy. I really liked the girl power in it. Diablo 4, for example, is also interesting. Doom Eternal, Plague Tale Requiem. They make some. There's a scene about the Jubilee, and it's also really well done. It's a good scene. Also Pentiment, so that's more an indie game. Before Your Eyes, so the games that they can catch on Netflix, for example, Spiritfarer, Minecraft. There are you will see in the link.
So many different examples.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and I'm going to share all of those and the link to your blogs as well in the description. Lars, I saw that you wanted to jump in as well regarding the topic of combining religion and games in education, and what maybe the added value of that is, even if it's quite maybe a non-religious student population.
I guess it depends on whether we're teaching game developers or you know, generally kind of students. Like, sure, I'm not sure if I wanted to jump in, but I think for like game developing students, it's just like an important cultural language to have. Look, I'm a bit wary of like the effect that if we were a panel of like four cobblers, then the conclusion would always be that shoes are the most important thing in the world. And so we're like a bunch of religion and game scholars. So obviously we're going to say that religion's super important and it's so core to games and so on. But it's just another like bit of cultural heritage and like language that you can be handed if you make games, right? One thing I'd really like to see is if students that are learning to make games can kind of draw on their own experience. So again, if I just repeat the same thing that I've been saying, that we see the same kind of conventional representation over and over. It's always a priest that heals, even if it's, you know, a non-Christian game developer obviously making it. I'd really like to see game designers draw on specifically designers, especially to draw on their own cultural background, whether that's religious or, you know, linguistic or philosophical or cultural or whatever. And I think that would add so much to, let's say, the next generation of game developers. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Bram. Join right in. You're very welcome. And then I also see a really interesting question from the chat that I want to tackle as soon as we're finished here. Just a reminder for all of you on Twitch, if you have a question for the panelists, now is the time. Go ahead and pop it in the chat and we'll get to it very shortly. Bram, go right ahead.
I quickly wanted to jump in. given that I'm the person who worked as a historian on the wars of religion and said to his supervisor that I didn't think that religion mattered that much in the political discussions that I saw. So it's if there I think if there's someone around the table who maybe again accidentally ended up dealing with religion, it could be me. And in that respect, there are two things I want to highlight. One, religion was and is important. So if you're looking at contemporary conflicts from Gaza and Israel to Ukraine and Russia, religious influences, religious arguments, they are important. They matter greatly. So why not use a game on religion or with religious influences to tie that to those topics, even though they are painful to talk about? The second thing is we all know that religions are great at storytelling. So when you have points to make about general principles, about I wouldn't call them general truths, but things that people have been mulling over for centuries and millennia, why not use religion to bring up those points? So they have a very contemporary relevance, or religion has a very contemporary relevance, and it has a relevance in terms of who we are as human beings and how we discuss core topics to us. So even though I'm not a religious scholar and keep on accidentally hitting on these, I think those two make it core and are also the reason why I keep hitting on them accidentally. They're so crucial in a contemporary and in a historical perspective that it really makes sense to include them from an educational perspective as well.
Absolutely. Yes, Rachel.
I just wanted to build on that a little bit, especially this notion of storytelling. I think it's also important for game designers to know what stories they're tapping into, what stories are they choosing to tell. Years ago, I wrote a piece called Xbox Apocalypse. It shows up in Godwired too, but it's just about the apocalyptic qualities to first game shooters in general, right? That you save the world by killing people. And that story is told over and over and over again. And so I think, religion can help inform our awareness of the stories that we're already telling so that, we're not accidentally buying into a larger racist or ethnocentric or Islamophobic or sexist story with the games that we make.
And also just as you say, Rachel, there's such an oversaturation of those exact kind of themes. So really thinking, well, like what story should I tell and what story should be told or like will add value to to this space. That's not the same story over and over again. Jumping over to the chat, I see from Dirt Scientist. Hello, Dirt Scientist. The question reads, should real-life religions be kept separate from video games? Should games only focus on made-up religions? Bram, I see a bit of a giggle there. Anything to add? Or just giggling for giggle's sake?
No, the project I've been most involved with really deals I can't discuss it too much, but it uses both non-existent religions or their historic religions, but nobody practices them anymore, and then religions that are still very much present in society. And again, it boils down to choice and whether you want to make the hard choice. The easiest thing is to make them completely fictional or use historic religions. Go back to Roman religion, Roman gods, age of mythology, and you're basically fine. So that's a very safe choice. It's also a very classic one, an original one. If you want to go to real life religions, it will be more original. It's more dangerous, as Lars pointed out. You need to be wary of the risk that you don't want your game to become necessarily about those religions. You don't want to make a point about them. But again, you can do it, but then it comes down to making the choice consciously, respectfully, and be ready to own your s dot 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 and so on. So don't use them if you're not up to facing the consequences of the choices that you make as a game developer. So I'm always like, when I'm advising on this, it's your game, it's your choice, it's your piece of art, but do things with determination and with thinking things through, and then you can go either option, I think.
Say that I am just piggybacking off of this question, say that I'm inventing or coming up with kind of my kind of religion that I want to be in my game. That is fictional, but also maybe based on facets or elements of real life religions. Are there any guidelines that I should be following in terms of inventing this like bespoke religion for my game? Things to do, not do, in terms of riding that line of being culturally sensitive and not offensive. Maybe Rachel, go right ahead.
Well, what I'm thinking about is an assignment that I've actually never given, but religion professors do sometimes give, which is design your own religion, right? Which is exactly what you're talking about. And it's really a problematic assignment because it presumes that religions can be distilled down, right, to objects, to text, to leaders, right, to these sort of like essential components. And that's what makes up religion, when religion is a lived experience and it's entered into in, you know, different ways by different people at different times, like Bram, you were saying. I think that was you talking about that earlier. So yeah, I think it's, I mean, I understand why games would do it, but and I'm asking myself as we're talking, like I love Journey. So why is that okay? I love Monument. Why are those games okay? And I think it is because they don't try and do everything. They just sort of gesture in terms of religious experience. Like they play with the idea of ritual. And they're also, I think that, and there's an art to this, and I'm not a designer, but how can you create a game that asks questions about meaning rather than teaches meaning or tells people what to think about religion? And I think if you're going to take that kind of essentialist approach, that openness is a better way to go.
That's a really good point there about opening up a space to kind of question these things, or maybe like also internally debate moral dilemmas or such, but not necessarily giving you like a dogma which to follow through a game. I think it's more about the experience of thinking and philosophically getting involved. Bram, I wonder, because you just mentioned in the game that you're working on now, so there's elements from of real life religions, but also fictional pieces as well. So I'm curious to hear from you, what are your to-dos, do's or do not do's when it comes to piecing together elements of a fictional religion in a game?
All right. So fairly important is that it's not necessarily my game. I'm consulting, or have been consulting with the people who are really making this. So all choices they make are theirs, and I think that is really also important to answer your question. Are there do's and don'ts? It depends on where you want to end up. So, for example, I don't like fantasy games for some of the reason that Rachel just explained. They're fictional religions and they're flat to me. I mean, you could change the names, you could change the people, you could change whatever is being told over and over and over again. So for me, the emotional stakes are not high enough. The connection with lived experience is not important enough. So if you're looking for those things, emotions, positive or negative, connections with lived experience, with history, then go for a real religion and start using the word playing or toying with that in a respectful manner. If you want to stay on the safe side, design something, but do know that your religion will be interchangeable with 100,000 other games. So any do's or don'ts, I would need to know what you want to do with your game. Do you want it to be controversial? Do you want it to be flat and highly commercial? Do you want it to stay low on the religious level? Do you want it to have certain peaks? It really depends on what you want to do, and from there you can determine your do's and don'ts.
Yep, that absolutely makes sense. Lars, I can't tell if you unmuted yourself or not.
I did. I was kind of looking at you to see if we had time, because
Of
I
course,
kind
we definitely have time.
of
Go right ahead, Lars.
I happen to have pretty much the exact opposite opinion. I don't know if that's, very productive. It usually is, but I feel like if you use like a historically, especially currently kind of occurring religion, you're gonna have to stay at this kind of superficial level of, what do people like about religion when they're not necessarily religious? What will not upset people that don't like that religion, right? And this is an important question because we know that pretty much young people in the West are more likely to see religion in video games than in a place of worship, like churches and mosques and temples. So what certain religions are really, or what certain video games are really good at, is taking that surface level thing of the mosques and the temples, right? Just having the candles and the singing and the way the light hits a good, like nice Catholic church, right? But then that's all we want. We don't want the actual Christianity. We don't want the actual kind of teachings or substances or beliefs. If you want depth, you got to make up your own religion, is what I'm saying. Like, if we look at the Elder Scrolls, there's so much more happening than what Bioshock can do with Christianity, right? It gives artists so much more freedom to kind of make up their own like cool rituals and their own pantheons without offending a whole bunch of people. Um, but we'll see what happens. So
That's a really interesting. Liesbeth, I wonder if you have any opinions here regarding fictional religions, bespoke religions in games and guidelines to follow there. Whether it's more of an opportunity to be less superficial.
It's a difficult question because I'm a consumer and I write articles about them. But I think it's dangerous to really depict religious belief from today, like Christianity. There are a lot of layers in religious people, in communities. So I think it's difficult. And when you really want to touch some gamers, I think a video game like Journey or there are a lot of like monuments, like Rachel said, that can do more, I think, than just depicting a religion that we all know. I guess it's difficult. I will talk about it. I will think about it, and maybe in another talk, I can give you the answer because it's not an easy question.
Absolutely not. I think this entire topic, there's a lot of nuance and complexity, maybe more so honestly than any other topic that we've covered on Game for Thought thus far. I'm taking a look at our time, and unfortunately, we could talk about this for many hours to come, but unfortunately, we are just out of time. But I'd like to ask the four of you, Bram, Lars, Rachel, Liesbeth, I know it's tough, but any last words, any messages that you'd like to share to the audience? There are industry professionals that might be watching this later. There are students watching at the moment. What would you like to say to the audience as your final words regarding the topic of religion, games, things for them to take away from this talk?
If I may jump right in, I want to correct myself on one point that I've just made in terms of the do's and don'ts. Be very wary of symbols. So religious symbols, crosses, crescent moons, the Torah, the Bible, whenever you deal with those, be very, very wary because they're very, very sensitive. So that would be my correction on my earlier statements that I really want to get out. You're absolutely free to pursue your own artistic freedom and do whatever you want with the flexibility and freedom that games have to offer. Be prepared to do so respectfully. Be prepared to discuss what you've been doing. But in terms of practical advice, symbols are one thing that you need to think really hard about how you're going to include them, and whether or not they're necessary and used in a proper manner. So that would be where I would like to leave it tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bram. Really appreciate it. Lars, go right ahead.
I also wanted to take this last chance to correct Bram. No, that's not very fair of me. But I do want to say, actually, completely, please lean into the crosses and the symbols and everything, because it's such a rich game design conventional language that we have. Again, just like walking from the left to the right on the screen, we expect the cross to do a certain thing. It heals, it kills zombies. This is how we use cultural heritage. Religion isn't, paradoxically, much more holy or sacred than other parts of culture. It's just a thing. It's a very European perspective, but that's what I'll go with. I highly recommend reading Rachel's book, reading my book once you're done with that, and have a good evening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bram. Rachel, I see you next.
Sure. Yeah, well, what's on my mind is that I've been teaching a class on hope for 4 semesters now, and partly just because of how dark and difficult the world has been in the last few years, and with conflict in the Middle East and racism in America, and everything. I just kind of want to invite people to lean toward care. I mean, it doesn't mean that you don't represent, it doesn't mean that you do. But the world is hard enough, and there's plenty of room to play with religious themes and ideas that I don't see any. I mean, people have the right, but I don't see the need to create games that are intentionally playing with offense. Obviously, people can do and will do whatever they want. So this is just an invitation to as much care and kindness as people can put into their designs.
I wholeheartedly second that message. Thank you so much. Yes, snaps for Rachel, snaps in the chat for Rachel. Appreciate it. And Liesbeth.
Okay, so I think religious references are intriguing in video games, and even more when you can play with it. I love it. Like in Metro Exodus, for example, you see icons in buildings, and it triggers people to start a conversation online and offline, or discussions about subject that matters, like ethical questions. And I think it's really great if you know as a developer what it is to be a Christian or to be a Muslim, what it is to believe in God. And that is what sometimes I miss in video games. I see a depiction of religion, but I can't relate because I feel that the developer doesn't know what it is to believe in God, and that's sometimes painful. But it's very important when there is some respect for when there's respect for religious belief. That's the most important thing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the four of you. This is the dream collection of panelists when we're talking about the topic of religion in games. So many thanks to Bram, Lars, Liesbeth, and Rachel. If we can give some appreciation in the chat for your insights this evening. Thank you so very much. And if you were watching on Twitch, stick around for just a minute or so more, and I'll give you some more information about when you can watch the next Game for Thought stream. Hang on, we'll be right back. Thank you so very much for watching yet another live stream of Game for Thought, where we tackled the very complex but also very interesting topic of religion in games. Of course, I would like to thank our fantastic panelists for the evening, Bram, Lars, Rachel, and Liesbeth. I'd also like to give a big thank you, as always, to Casper and Elevate for the technical assistance this evening, our moderation crew out there helping out in the chat. And of course, I'd like to thank Hoest DIE, the Flemish Audiovisual Fund, Flanders Game Hub, the Flemish Games Association, and Elevate for supporting Game for Thought. And if you are already looking forward to the next Game for Thought live stream, twins, because me too. Check out the next Game for Thought on Wednesday, the 17th of April. Next month, it'll come around very soon, where we will be talking about being a parent of a gamer. So perhaps those of you in the chat who find that topic interesting, already mark it in your calendars for the 17th of April. Thank you so much for watching the stream. We really hope that you had some interesting takeaways from the discussion and hope to continue to discuss these topics within your social groups. And with that, have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever this video finds you. Thank you so much once again for tuning in to Game for Thought. Have a wonderful evening. Bye, everyone.